Now this is a sermon that I have been promising you for a little while, and we haven't gotten to yet, and the reason is because this is a sermon where one of the things we're going to talk about is what happens when a child dies, when an infant dies. One of the questions we get from non-believers especially is, we've heard that if you don't believe in Christ, you go to hell. How could a holy God or a just God or a loving God send a child to hell who doesn't know any better? And is that really what's going to happen? And the other thing we have is, as believers, we have to look at, is there actually, like I said, what actually happens when an infant actually dies before he has any ability to know anything about Jesus Christ? We're going to talk about that and answer that question today. There's a lot of people that have given answers over the years, and frankly, they're nice answers, but I don't think they're satisfying from a scriptural standpoint. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do right now is talk to you about something happening about probably about 35 years ago now. I've mentioned it before to many of you, and you've heard about it, but I'm going to mention it again, and there's a thing or two you didn't know in the past that I want to tell you about. I went to a church right near here about 35 years ago where some strange things started happening, and I started questioning the pastor on some things. Well, as it turned out, the last thing that pastor did was stand in the pulpit and call down God's wrath on liars and ask that the liars be exposed in the church and that they be kicked out of the church. And by liars, he meant me and 8 other people. In addition to that, what happened was we had paid as a church for him to finish his master's in clinical psychology at Harvard and his doctorate in clinical psychology at Harvard. And he opened a Christian counseling center in the church as well. So he was the head counselor. He was testifying in court hearings on behalf of people as a psychologist. He was the pastor of the church and had been there almost 10 years. On that day that he called for God's wrath to come down upon liars, I started doing some digging. And as many of you, like I've told many of you about this, what it turned out in the end was every last degree the man had was fake. Every last experience he had was fake. He even lied about being a member of a mission society, and all you had to do was pay $25 dues and you'd have been a member. He even lied about that. Virtually everything in his life was a lie. Even if you talk to his neighbors, you'd have a totally different impression of him than you would if you met him in the church. 2 totally different people. His entire college experience, it turns out, was evidently 1 semester of Bible college, at which point in time he got thrown out of the Bible college. All this time, like I said, the church is paying for him to spend summers up in Massachusetts. Not only that, we're paying for him to take Thursdays off to be a psychologist over at Georgetown University Hospital. By the time it got done, within a 3-day period, and I believe God actually gave this to me, within 3 days, I ended up getting 30 separate documents to document he was a liar. I had a document from the dean of Georgetown University where he claimed to have taken some of his doctoral classes, claimed that they had a reciprocal agreement with Harvard, and that's how he took the classes. Well, the dean, when I told him what was going on, said, "Come on down here and meet with me." By the time I got there, he had a notarized letter for me saying that not only had they never had reciprocal agreements in the doctoral program with anyone, but during the years that he claimed to have taken his courses at Georgetown, Georgetown had no graduate psychology department. So obviously he wasn't taking graduate courses at Georgetown. I had a letter from, again, notarized letter from a woman he claimed to have done his internship at Massachusetts General Hospital. I had a letter from a woman up there who had personally known every intern for 30 or 40 years and said, he is not one of them and has never been here. I had documentation from Harvard. I had documentation from American University, where he claimed to have done his Master of Divinity, showing that everything was false. By the time it was done, you had 30 separate pieces of information. Now, here's what I don't think I've told you about before. That information was copied down and given out as packets to people in the congregation because we felt they needed to know the truth. Don't hide this thing. Let people know what's going on. Gather your wits, figure out what's going on, turn to God, and we'll all be okay. Well, that's not what happened. Even with that 30-sheet packet of information in their hands, I would say about 100 to 200 people didn't believe it. Thought that it was all lies, even though it was notarized. Even though his own elders finally came out and said, you know something, we checked it out, it's true also. And not only did they believe it so strongly, they actually went with this guy and formed a new church and made him pastor of that church. Until about 4 months later, they found out he was evidently scamming them, and then he had to kick him out of that church. The point is, even with everything in their hands to document it and show what was true, it didn't matter. They didn't want to believe it. Now, the reason I'm telling you about this is because we have a situation in the Scripture today that's very similar to that. This Scripture is actually complicated, but relatively straightforward as long as you actually believe what Paul said. But when you start with the premise that Paul said the law is dead, for example, and then say, but he really didn't mean that because he couldn't mean that, then you got a problem interpreting passages like this. And some of the way these passages have been interpreted by the church, it's almost shameful, the twists and turns they've done in order to interpret them. And what it all comes down to is this: they don't want to believe what's right in front of their eyes because it goes against their personal beliefs, whereas what we're trying to say is, I don't care about my personal beliefs, I care about what's in the Bible. In context, what it actually says, and getting to the truth of what is the real truth here. That's what we're going to see today, and when we see that today, we're actually going to see a wonderful message come out of this chapter. Now, if we start in verse 7 says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.'" The first thing we have here is a question from Paul: is the law sin? Because what happens is a lot of people, when they do something wrong, instead of admitting they've done something wrong, want to blame the law that says it's wrong. We see this a lot of times. I've told you about it before. I had people that plagiarized when I was a college professor, and I caught them red-handed with the entire paper copied from websites, cut and paste. What'd they do? They blamed me for it. I shouldn't have been checking that deeply. I was having a wonderful day until you found this. You wouldn't believe the excuses you get. Only one person ever actually said, "Yeah, I did it, I was wrong." People want to say, hey, it's the law that's the problem. If the law wasn't so strict, let's face it, all you got to do is watch people the way they drive around here. It's obvious people don't feel the law should be as strict as it is. I'm not advocating for loosening it up. But the point is, people don't want to accept that, and they want to blame the law. And Paul's question here is the law the problem? Is the law sin? The answer is obvious. No, it's not. The law isn't sin. The law highlights sin. When you have a law that says, for example, do not run a red light, which we have around here. Believe it or not, it actually is a law. I know you wouldn't know it from watching traffic. But when I go out to an intersection and I see 4 cars run a red light without even slowing down, and then get mad at the people who might want to pull out into traffic on the green light, you have to wonder what's wrong with them. And the truth, though, is we would probably never say that it's the law that's wrong. No, it's the people running the red light that's wrong. Same situation here. People want to say the law is the problem. It's not the law that's the problem. The law shows what the real problem is. The problem is sin. It's very simple. Now, if we look at verse 7, also what we see is there is a knowledge of the law that Paul at some point in time started to see. Because without the law, essentially Paul's saying he was ignorant and he was happy. No problems. Before he knew about the law, hey, he wasn't being convicted. If you don't know it's wrong, you're not going to be convicted about it. And we also saw last week and the week before that the more laws you have, the more opportunity there is for sin. And let's face it, if there was only one law in the United States, we could probably all obey it. On the other hand, if you've got, the stacks and stacks and stacks of county, federal, and state laws, it's hard. Believe it or not, most of us violate the law every day and don't even know it. Been a lot of studies done that show we're violating the law, but there's so many laws we can't even keep track of what they are. Well, we get the same thing here with the Old Testament law. It's not that the law is wrong, but it's so voluminous it points out about the fact that there was a problem with sin. But there was a point in time in Paul's life he didn't know that and didn't understand that. And then he uses the example of covetousness. Makes sense to talk about that? That's probably one of the first sins that we have as we get older. You think about it. You're a kid and all of a sudden, I want that. I don't care if it's mine or not, I want that. That's what he's talking about here with covetousness. That's probably one of the first sins. That's why it came to mind for him. But what we can see from this verse is there was a point in time in Paul's life when he was ignorant of the law. Now, there's a difference between the word ignorant and stupid. Ignorant means unaware of, not familiar with. So when I say he's ignorant of the law, we're not insulting Paul. What we're saying is he just didn't know about the law, because there's a point in time when he didn't understand it, didn't know it. Now, if we go on to verse 8, it says, "But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind, for apart from the law, sin is dead." It's kind of a strange thing to say, apart from the law, sin is dead, but if you think about it, if there is no law against something, it's not wrong. Now, when I say that, there's all kinds of laws. For example, there's laws from God that aren't written down as laws, but we know it's wrong because He's told our conscience it's wrong. But think about this in terms of laws that we might break. If there's no law against it, one of the problems they have is sometimes prosecuting a person for something that's clearly wrong, but that the government forgot to write a law against it. I don't know if you remember it or not, but one of the big controversies 5 or 10 years ago is a lot of states actually had no law against a guy wearing a camera on his foot and taking pictures of women's dresses. And they found that as horrible as it was, they couldn't prosecute. So they had to rush to make a law against this. If there's no law, in this case, what he's saying is there's no sin. Now, the law here he's talking about is Mosaic law. However, think about it. There was always some kind of a standard. Adam and Eve had a law. The law was simple. Don't eat the fruit. That was it. That was the entire summary of the law is don't eat the fruit. They couldn't follow that law. Everyone has a standard they are judged by. Even non-believers who have never heard about God still know right from wrong. So everyone has a standard, so we're not out of it because we didn't get the Mosaic law. But again now, here the problem is, it's not the law that's the problem, it's the law that's showing that sin is a problem. Now we're going to get to verse 9, and verse 9 is where we start to get to the meat of infant salvation, the question about that. Verse 9 said, "And I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became a slave, and I died. And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me." One of the things you'll see if you talk about is a baby saved when a baby dies without knowing anything about God. And by the way, when I say baby, I am also including aborted babies. Still a living baby, but when a baby dies before it could possibly make a decision. There has traditionally been a doctrine called the age of accountability. I like the doctrine, but I've always been unsatisfied with that doctrine as far as how it's been supported. One of the verses that's used to support it is Deuteronomy 1:38 and 39, which says, "Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter there. Encourage him, for he will cause Israel to inherit it. Moreover, your little ones, who you said would become a prey, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good and evil, shall enter there, and I will give it to them, and they shall possess it." The key phrase is, your sons who have no knowledge of good and evil. So obviously there is a point in time where they don't know good from evil. And the problem with that verse is, it's true, there's a point in time when they don't know good from evil, but it never says what's going to happen to them, because when it's talking about entering in, that's not talking about heaven, that's talking about the land of Israel. Sometimes you have Nehemiah 8:2 and 3 used. "Then Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding. On the first day of the 7th month, he read it from before the square, which is in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday, in the presence of men and women, those who could understand, and all the people were attentive to the book of the law." So clearly, again, he's differentiating between those who can understand the law and those who can't understand the law. But again, that really doesn't say anything about what happens to those who die without understanding. But it is showing there is a differentiation there. If you look at Isaiah 7:16, it says, "For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken." It's actually talking about Christ there. But the point is that before, as an infant, before he knew good from evil as a human, there was obviously a time of innocence. Now, in the case of Christ, it's not talking about what's going to happen to him, because Christ isn't going to have to worry about hell because he was sinless. However, the point is, again, showing that even with God, or even with Christ rather, the human part of Christ, there was a time of a lack of understanding as an infant. All of that's nice, but again, doesn't really address the key question: what happens to a baby with this who doesn't understand? Now, the primary verse that's usually used to prove that a baby would go to heaven if it dies without understanding is 2 Samuel 12:21 through 23. Now, to understand the context of this is where David has had an illicit affair with Bathsheba, and a son has been born, and that son ends up dying. And that verse says, "Then his servant said to him, 'What is this thing that you have done? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But when the child died, you arose and ate food.' He said, 'While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me that the Lord may live. But now he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me.'" So what you have there is David saying, I'm going to go to heaven and I'm going to see my child again, even though he's not coming back. And that's the proof that's usually laid out for saying that obviously children without understanding go to heaven if they die. The problem is that this is an absolutely factual recording in the Bible of what David said. But there's something you have to be aware of. There are times in the Bible, and I do believe that David is accurate in what he said here. But to take this as doctrine is dangerous, and here's why. There are points and times in the Bible where the Bible accurately and factually records what someone says without validating whether it's true or not. I mean, for example, when Lazarus died, they said, hey, he's dead, he can't come back, you're too late. That was factually true that they said that. Was it true? Of course not. Christ rose Lazarus from the dead. So this isn't a problem with the Bible, and this isn't a problem with inspiration. It's that there are times when the Bible is, and this is a quotation here, where the Bible will take and quote someone for what they said, but it may or may not be accurate. And even though I believe this is accurate, it's not proof that an infant, when he dies, would go to heaven because he didn't have understanding. That's why we come to this passage right here that is frequently ignored by people because they want to change what Paul's saying. The first thing we have to look at in verse 9 is it says, "And I was once alive apart from the law." What's he talking about? I was once alive apart from the law. Well, wasn't the law in effect Paul's entire life? It doesn't make sense to say I was alive before the law. He may not have known of the law, but it was still there. Now remember, the reason I say this is because when it says about that, remember what the verses right before that said. The law is what came alive and made sin live within him. And not only that, if we start looking, let's take a look, for example, in Romans 3:20. Romans 3:20 says, "Because by works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes knowledge of sin." So it was the law that made Paul aware of the sin. Romans 4:15 says, "For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there is no violation." It's the law that makes it wrong to sin. In this case, he's saying there's no violation without it. And again, he's talking here about the Mosaic law, but the point is, there is a point in time of understanding when suddenly the law becomes valid to that person, and that person becomes judged. They're sinning already, but they are then judged as a sinner. In Romans 5:13 it says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. So the fact is there's sin there, but the sin's not charged to the person without the law. Now you still could go, wait a second, this is the little wiggle room here, but I'm trying to set the context for you. Because if you look, here's what Paul says. I was alive apart from the law, but the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died. So here's what you have Paul saying. I was alive, then I died, and then he goes on later to say, and I became alive again. What's he talking about? When could that possibly fit? The only way to make it fit is if you realize that when Paul said he was alive without the law, is he was saying he was not going to be charged for that sin. When he understood the law, that's when he died spiritually. That's when he was separated from God. That's when he was not covered by grace. When he became alive again, that's when he was saved. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I firmly believe that this is a theological basis for why an infant is saved if an infant dies without the knowledge of Christ. Why all aborted babies are saved. Now one of the questions you might, and we're going to go into this more, but one of the questions you might be asking is, why even bother talking about this? I can almost guarantee that at some point in time, most of you are going to hit somebody who has either had an abortion, or a woman who's had a miscarriage, or someone who's lost a child, and you're going to need to counsel them. And I'm not saying that, just as a friend, I'm not saying that you're going to be able to go through the entire theological explanation. But at the very least, we should be able to point them in the right direction and be able to say to them, your child is alive today. Now, if we continue on to this and look at it, we see that death and the knowledge of the law is what brings about the knowledge of right and wrong. And we see that that death he's talking about is the spiritual death. There's also something else I think that we have to tie into this, though, that we've kind of missed. We may have a misconception about what happens at salvation. Well, not what happens at salvation, what happens for an innocent child. Because one of the questions you still have is, well, wait a second, even if this alive, dead, alive thing works, how do you tie that in with all are sinners, and if you don't turn to Christ, you're going to hell? Because that's true. One thing I want us to look at is, I want us to look in the Bible, it talks about the book of life in a number of places. In Revelation 21:27, and I realize we're getting kind of technical here today, but we kind of have to see what's happening, and it's important. Revelation 21:27 says, and nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. He's talking about entry into the New Jerusalem. He's saying no one other than those in the Lamb's book of life is going to get into the New Jerusalem. So your name has to be written in the book of life. The typical interpretation is, when you become a believer, God writes your name in the book of life, and then everything's cool from then on. The next verse is Philippians 4:3, which says, indeed, true companion, I ask you also to help these women who have shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers, here's the key, whose names are in the book of life. So again, believers, their names are in the book of life. So it's obvious. You're a believer, your name's in the book of life, you go to heaven. Revelation 20:15 says, and if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So if your name's not in the book of life, you go to the lake of fire. If your name is in the book of life, you go to heaven. Actually, New Jerusalem. But there's a few other verses that make you say, wait a second, what's he talking about? In Psalm 69:27 and 28, it says, add iniquity to their iniquity, and may they not come into your righteousness. May they be blotted out of the book of life, and may they not be recorded with the righteous. So we're talking about someone's name being erased or blotted out of the book of life. Now you could say there, well, that's Old Testament, so therefore different standard in the Old Testament, and that's what's happening here. But let me read one more verse to you. Revelation 3:5. He who overcomes, and by the way, he who overcomes is talking about all believers. He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life. And I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. So believers will not be erased or blotted out of the book of life. But there appears to be this possibility of names being blotted out of the book of life, obviously. How do we square that with the fact that we know that once a person is saved, they're always saved? Does that really make any sense? I think it does. And I think what's happened is we made an assumption. We made a leap that isn't necessarily true. If you look at all these verses in together, and several other verses, I think the most probable thing that's happening here is life is actually recording every name of every person that either will be born or has been born in history. All names are in the book of life. Does that mean everybody's going to heaven? No. I believe when a person dies rejecting Christ, without Christ, at that point in time, their name is blotted out of the book of life. So by the time you get done, the only thing, and this is consistent with all these verses, the only thing you have in the end is people who are believers. The important thing, though, is the person is actually condemned for rejecting Christ. We hear about things like blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, unpardonable sins. I believe the only unpardonable sin is rejecting Jesus. Now, by the way, something I should mention here. Rejecting Jesus does not mean saying, I hate you, God, I don't want you. If you are exposed to the gospel and do not believe on Christ, that's the same as rejecting. Rejecting can be passive as well as active. So this isn't a loophole to get everybody into heaven. Don't make that mistake. But from a technical standpoint, I think what's happening here is these names are actually blotted out as each person who has understanding dies. Because of that, an infant who has no understanding is still covered by grace. And there's no need for God to blot them out of the book of life. And because of that, when Paul says, I was alive, then I was dead, then I was alive, It makes sense. It's actually fairly simple to interpret. Had he died as an infant before understanding anything about the law and right and wrong, had he died before he knew what covetousness was, Paul would have gone to heaven. That's when he was alive. The moment he understood right from wrong and had an understanding, we don't know when that moment was, but at a certain point in time, had he died then, he would have gone to hell. The alive again comes about at the time when he becomes a believer. Now there's one other possibility I will raise as far as the book of life goes. Ephesians 4, 1 through 5 says that God knew each one of us before the foundation of the earth. Another possibility is he knew everyone that would be covered by grace and therefore wrote their names in the book of life already. I don't think that's as likely as the other because, again, we have references to people being blotted out of the book of life. Blotted out is almost like, hey, you would have made it, but your name got removed. And I really think what Paul's talking about here, if you accept the fact that the law is dead, if you accept the fact that Paul actually meant what he said, it's actually pretty straightforward. If an infant dies or an aborted child, or a child is aborted, they go to heaven. It's that simple. Now, there's something else that should be mentioned is that we don't know when this age of understanding comes about. And not only that, it's different for every person. I do believe there are people that can live their entire life and never reach the age of understanding. No, I'm not talking about most of the people that I meet on the street every day. I'm talking about people who are legitimately mentally handicapped and do not have the ability to understand right from wrong, do not have the ability to understand the gospel or comprehend it. So I think that age of accountability can be... I have known children that were 4 years old that actually truly believed in Christ and became a Christian and understood it. I've known other children of 4 years old that I could be wrong, but I don't think there was any way they could have understood it. So this is going to vary from person to person. But there is a real theological basis for this, not just... Honestly, we all want to say, well, God loves people, and because God loves people, He'd never send an infant to hell. That's a wonderful thing to say, but it's not a theological statement. What I'm saying is I think the Bible backs that up. And I think we can be comfortable in the fact that God does not send an infant to hell if the infant dies, and that aborted babies are in heaven. Again, not to excuse abortion. Abortion is murder. But there is at least some comfort that you can talk to a woman about who's had an abortion and say, look, at least you will meet your child someday, assuming she's a believer. Now, I do want to bring up several other views of this passage, and here's where I'm going to get to. Remember I talked in the beginning about some people just don't want to read, don't want to take what's written there? Here are the other common views for how to interpret this passage. John Calvin came up with a view that's been accepted by many, that what this is talking about is when Paul became a Pharisee. And that as a Pharisee, he thought he was alive because, he was perfect, and then later he realized he was a sinner, and then later he became a believer. Well, there's a problem with that. Paul may have thought he was alive, but he was still dead in his sins when he was a Pharisee. It doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit any of the context. And one of the things you've got to come up with here is, this does mean something. We have to figure out what it means. One of the other things, believe it or not, I've seen several commentaries that actually have written, the problem with this passage is determining who I is. What they're saying is, well, I couldn't possibly mean Paul. So therefore, I must mean someone else. The problem is that's really stretching the passage to start with. But for example, there's a very good commentator on Romans named Douglas Moo, who has several ideas he presents. And one of them is a possibility is that I actually means Adam. Because Adam was truly able to say at one point in time he was alive before sin, then he was dead, then he was alive. And that's nice. And Adam is mentioned in chapter 5. But Adam has nothing to do with this chapter. You really got to stretch. And the reason that they say that this can't be Paul is because they say that, well, the law was always with Paul. Now, I agree with that. But the knowledge of the law was not. And again, they're twisting it to try to find some way to explain this, and it's not there. The other thing that he said in his commentary, and again, other people believe this too, is that I is actually symbolic for the salvation history of Israel and the law itself. I'm sorry, I just don't see that. If I come along to you and say, I went to the grocery store the other day, I don't think any reasonable person would say, oh, he means the laws of the United States went to the grocery store. Or when I said I went to the grocery store, he didn't mean, oh, well, Bernie went to the grocery store for me. Not picking on you. But the point is I just happened to look out and see you. But the point is, I means I in this case. It's obvious what it means. It's only obvious if you can't accept what Paul said leading up to this. And that's where the problems start to come about. In this case, what Paul is saying very clearly is there is a point in time when someone is alive in relationship as far as they are not under the condemnation of sin prior to their ability to understand. And again, that varies person to person. But that's what it's actually saying. And again, it's very simple if you actually look at it. But it's normally not interpreted that way because it means you actually have to believe what Paul said. Now we move to continue in verse 9. It says, "And I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died. And this commandment which was to result in life proved to result in death for me. For sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me." Again here, when I'm looking at it, I'm seeing I, and I'm saying Paul is speaking about himself. And in his case, it was the Mosaic law that convicted him. He read it. Don't covet. Okay, I'm coveting. So you realize right and wrong there. We don't know how old Paul was. But the Mosaic law was what convicted Paul. However, as an application for other people, not necessarily the Mosaic law, everybody is under some form of some standard. If you are sitting somewhere in a country, you have never heard of Christ, you've never heard of the Bible, you still have a conscience. And that conscience will condemn a person. No one is justified by not knowing anything. It's not a matter of do you know or not, it's a matter of are you capable of understanding or not. That's the differentiation here. As far as when this happened with Paul, again, we can't answer that. Some people suggest 13 years old, but that's simply a Jewish tradition. I doubt that it's that old. I think that's way beyond when Paul understood this. And again, I think it's going to vary from person to person. The other thing to notice here is the commandment was intended for life. What's that mean? It means the law is good. It means the commandment was never intended to be a death sentence. But it is a death sentence because of the sin in our life. We're the ones that make the law a death sentence. No matter what law we're judged against, we're the ones that cause the problem. We can't blame the law for that. Adam and Eve were the only two people who ever had the option to really truly follow the law because they were created without a sin nature. And the other thing we see here is that Paul said he was killed by sin. As I said, it's not really, the law is what showed it to be sinful, and therefore it brought about death. But it wasn't actually the law that was killing him, but the law made sin real. It was the sin that killed Paul, and the sin that kills each one of us. Now, if we read verse 12 and 13, we see in 12, "So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous and good." Why is the law holy, and why is the commandment holy? Do you ever think about that? What is behind the law? What's behind right and wrong? Everything for right and wrong is based on the character of God. It's wrong to steal because God wouldn't steal. It's wrong to murder because God wouldn't murder. It's wrong to covet because God wouldn't covet. Whatever we're talking about sinful-wise, God's character is the standard that we're all compared to. Now, in the Mosaic law, there were additional laws added on to say, hey, you have to follow this simply to prove their faithfulness. But ultimately, even if you have no biblical law whatsoever, right is still right and wrong is still wrong because it goes against the character and nature of God. Part of the problem is we don't want to compare ourselves to God. I don't. Do you really want to compare yourself to God? We don't look to God. Next to the axe murderer, we look fine. Next to God, it's another story. I remember for years, I mentioned this before, I played fast-pitch softball and I also played high school and college baseball. And the fast-pitch softball was actually much more challenging than the college baseball was. Pitching was just as fast, but they could break the ball more and it was coming from 46 feet instead of 60 feet. Not only that, you still had base stealing, you still had 60-foot bases instead of 90. I looked pretty good when I played fast-pitch softball. I was usually a standout. I was usually one of the best hitters on the team, if not the best hitter on the team. I played catcher and first base, and most people didn't want to play catcher. I loved playing catcher. It was where the action was. But you know something? The day came along when a guy got on our team for a few weeks who had actually been drafted by the Seattle Mariners. As soon as he got on that team, I didn't look so good anymore. Not only could he out-hit me like crazy, but if you saw him throw the ball, you'd realize I have never seen a ball thrown that fast. It actually looked like it was wobbling in the air, it was so fast. And I couldn't catch it at first, even though I caught everything else. It actually took me about 5 minutes, and all of a sudden then I could catch it. I had to get used to it. But this guy was so much better than me, it was ridiculous. Same way with us when we compare ourselves to God. We are not going to come out good when we compare ourselves to God. That's the standard by which sin is judged. We don't look so good that way. And that's the problem. That's why any law will condemn us. If you look at verse 13, therefore did that which is good become a cause of death for me. May it never be. Rather it was sin, in order that it might be shown to be sin by effecting my death through that which is good. But through the commandment, sin became utterly sinful. First off, notice the word therefore. Here's my conclusion from everything I've been saying here. Did sin cause death? Did the good work of the law, rather, bring about death? No. Sin caused death, not the law, not the good of the law. The law was good. The law was pure. The law was holy. But sin brought about death. And it not only that, but the law highlights sin. And when he says to make it utterly sinful, it's a wonderful way of putting it, but that's really the way it is here, is that it just shows so completely and clearly how wrong it is. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen them or not, but some of these color illusions on the internet, where you see, there's one I saw last night, where you see strawberries that are red when they're not really red. There's no red in the photo at all. It's because of what's around it and what makes it look that way. If we're comparing ourselves to a sinful world, we look okay. If we're comparing ourselves to the law and a holy God and right and wrong, we're not okay. And something I remember very vividly is when I was about 19 years old, I spent a month in Dominica in the West Indies as a summer missionary with a team. And when we got to Dominica, one of the things I found is Dominica really was a protein-starved nation. When they ate a chicken, except for the feathers and the toenails, they ate a chicken, literally. I mean, the skull, the bones, everything. And the reason is because they didn't have much protein. They needed protein. Now, I didn't eat the skull and the bones. What I basically did was, I didn't have any meat for a month. I mean, it was something where there was very little meat on the island to start with, and the meat that was there was not really that appetizing. Well, here's what happened. We got on the airplane, we stopped in Puerto Rico on the way back, spent a day or two there, got on the airplane to come back to Baltimore from Puerto Rico. Eastern Airlines, 727 stretch, I still remember it. And they brought around dinner. And dinner was airline food chicken. I don't know if you had airline food chicken in economy class, okay? Airline food chicken in economy class is nothing to brag about. If you go to Jerry's Seafood or Pasta Plus or any number of places around here, you're going to find it's definitely better than airline food chicken. You know what happened? I not only ate my chicken, they had an extra dinner they asked me if I wanted. I ate that chicken dinner. And then my friend didn't want theirs, so I ate their chicken dinner. You know something? That chicken may have been the best chicken I've ever had in my life. Whoa. That may have been the best chicken I've ever had. And the reason it was good was because of my point of comparison. For a month, I had no meat. You go for a month without meat, almost any chicken tastes good. This is the situation we have here. When we compare ourselves to others, we look okay. Compare ourselves to the law of God, we're not okay. Just like that airline chicken. Airline chicken's fine until you compare it to the law of God. Now let's deal with a couple of quick applications. Number one, how do we deal with abortion? Number one, do not back down and say abortion is okay. Abortion is murder. The only possible exception would be in a true case of life of the mother, where it's literally self-defense. However, those are so exceptionally rare. I've talked to doctors about this who know about it, and they've told me they're so incredibly rare they're almost not worth mentioning. It doesn't mean life of the mother believe it or not, life of the mother, you know when that exclusion first started? Doctors would actually say to a woman, you're going to kill yourself if you have to have this kid, won't you? And a woman said, no, of course not. Doctors say, you're going to kill yourself if you have to have this kid, won't you? This is before Roe versus Wade. And then finally when they say yes, they say now it's a case of life of the mother. That's not what I'm talking about when I say life of the mother. What I'm saying is literal, she dies right then if you don't abort this baby. That's different. Other than self-defense, abortion is murder. Don't back down from that. That's biblical. However, by the same token, not backing down from abortion as murder doesn't mean we have to treat the victim wrong. And the victim is not just the baby. The victim is the woman who's bought into this, that it's okay to do it. I've had many women, before I was ever doing this with our church, I've had many women who are friends or who knew me, who have come to me in the past and said, my life is totally screwed up and I need to talk to somebody to tell them, and in each case, because they had an abortion. And they were so guilty about it, and in each case I was able to tell them, you know what I told them? Even though it was wrong what you did, don't back down from that. Because they need to realize it was wrong. By the same token, your child is in heaven today. Boy, that changes their whole perspective on this. And again, I don't mean kill babies in order to get them to heaven, but what I am saying is, when you're dealing with someone and you're counseling someone as a friend who's had an abortion, you can tell them that child is in heaven today. It wasn't just a blob, it's a child that is in heaven now. It's funny, when it sinks in, it changes their whole outlook and their whole perspective on things. Aborted babies are covered by grace. That's what we get out of Romans 7 here. The second thing I want to talk about is, it's very easy to take these things that I've talked about blotting out the book of life and about how grace covers children that are not able to understand, and try to extend that. And to extend it to, well, God is a graceful, loving God, so He'll just cover everybody, and eventually everybody gets into heaven. That is not what we're talking about here. And we can't say if they don't know, they'll be saved. This is not a lack of knowledge. This is a lack of understanding, a lack of ability to understand that covers a child. We should still be sending out missionaries. We should still be witnessing. It's not like if we tell somebody, suddenly we're going to condemn them to hell. The truth is, all unbelievers are judged by some law, even if the law is just, you've done something wrong. Everyone who is an unbeliever is going to be judged by God. The only exception is a child that's covered because he didn't understand. Everyone who is an unbeliever is going to end up in hell. So obviously we want to be spreading the gospel. Don't take this in any way to be universalism, and don't take this as a way of saying, don't tell them. Because I've actually had people, believe it or not, I've actually had people tell me, well, maybe we shouldn't go to countries that have never had the gospel, because if they don't know, they'll get in. No, that's not true. They're not getting in because they didn't know. It's only a lack of ability to understand we're talking about here. The other thing that I put down here is that grace trumps law. But grace trumps law does not mean, and by the way, that's not a political statement. It's actually, I grew up playing bridge most of my life, so I use that term a lot. The truth is, again, not universalism, even though the grace wins out. The truth is, if a child doesn't know, then they'll be covered by grace. That's what I mean by grace trumps law. But I don't mean universalism. Now, there's one other thing that I want to bring up to conclude things today, just because I want to say, in all of this, even if I'm wrong in my interpretation, and I don't believe that I am, God is in control. It's very easy to sometimes get into theological arguments that are so deep that we start saying, wait a second, what about this, what about that, and forget about the fact that God knows, God will take care of it. Somehow God has worked this out. And I firmly believe this is what God said. But one of the things, it's a little thing, but one of the things that gives me hope for God being in control is something that I told you about early on, about when I was about 35 years ago. I told you about that with the story with the fake psychologist who claimed to be a pastor, and the net result of it, which I don't believe I have told you before. Maybe I have, but I don't believe I have. What I find astounding is that I was the single person that God used in order to expose this guy as far as finding the truth and finding the facts. Nobody believed me when I started this. But I said, this guy is not following what the Bible says, and I want to find out why. And I also thought he might be using mind control. That's how I started researching him. Nobody believed me. But God put so much stuff into my path in one day, in a 24-hour period, I couldn't get around it, that he was a complete fraud. What's interesting is this. What's interesting is, Linda and I came to this church about 4 or 5 years ago. We were looking for a church that taught the Bible, and it was hard to find one in this area. When we came to this church 4 or 5 years ago, I guess it was about 4 years ago or so, we decided to join this church. After we had already made the decision, and we didn't come here to become the teaching elder of this church or something like that, we just decided to join the church. After we joined the church, we started learning some things. What we learned was this church right here, except when it was in Washington, D.C., is the home church of that lying pastor psychologist that we talked about. He was Grace Brethren. He came from our church. We had no knowledge of that when we joined this church. And I find it ironic, and I find it God in control, that not only was I drawn to this church by God, but then in addition to that, 2 years ago, I didn't jump up and down and scream, "Pick me, pick me." The other elders asked me to start preaching here. And that ultimately, God being in control, I believe in His, not only irony, but for me to see it, how God has brought it around, the irony of putting me into the pulpit of the home church of the liar and the fraud that I exposed. I will never get over that. And I believe that absolutely was an act of God where God is in control. And frankly, I sit back sometimes and I laugh about it. But no matter what you believe, I can tell, and I've seen this over and over in my life, God is in control, God knows what's going on, and God knows what's happening with infants that die without able to understand. Let's go ahead and pray.